Well, hey, and welcome. I'm here with Shane Wood, author of Between Two Trees, and we're really excited to have a conversation about this book, how it came about, and just your process through that. So let's start at the beginning and I guess the end, so to speak, right? So Genesis 1, Revelation 22, okay? Most people know about the garden and the streets of gold, but why focus on two trees? Why is that the defining icons that pen this wonderful book?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's actually a question that I was pretty surprised when I was looking through some really like early church literature and the Bible. I actually was surprised that the tree of life didn't come up more often. Matter of fact, I only found that it came up in Proverbs, and it was even kind of in a metaphor outside of that. But what was striking to me is, I've studied Revelation for the past 15 to 18 years, and so Revelation to me isn't just the end of the Bible, but it actually is in a sense, it's kind of climaxing. It's gathering up all of these loose ends and referencing the rest of the Bible, and it ends in such a striking way, where we have this beautiful, idyllic, New Jerusalem coming down as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband, but it climaxes with this image of a tree. And so honestly, for me, what struck me was, and it was really, I was teaching it at Ozark Christian College, and we were coming to the very end, and honestly, the line came out that ends up becoming the book. It's like, we end where we began. Kind of. I mean, it's not like nothing happens, but we do. And then allowing the tree of life to be kind of a guiding metaphor to really wrestle with the entire biblical narrative, but then also our own individual narratives. Looking at the fact that all of life is lived between these two trees, and what does that mean? Yeah.
You mentioned that you taught Revelation for about 15 years, right? And you set out, when you started writing this book, to write a book about how to read Revelation. So why did you fail at that goal? What went wrong? How could you miss the mark so drastically?
That's awesome. Yeah, I totally did. I mean, like, I actually... even at one point, the title of the book was even like Simplifying Revelation. Like, I mean, my goal was to set out to write a book on how to read the book of Revelation. That was my goal. And really, it was a lot of different things happening in my life where I was wrestling deep, and I kind of felt like the Lord was ripping different things up in my heart. And so as I sat down to write, it was actually, I was just kind of doing some writing exercises to get into the mode. And the next thing I knew, the writing exercises kind of took over and became the book. And the next thing I know, and I talk about this in the introduction, where the next thing I know, I was writing a book on how the book of Revelation reads us. Yeah. Really how the entire Word of God reads us. And that was an aspect of studying the Word that I found to be the most refreshing of this, is this, we are not passive. When we come to the text is not passive, and neither are we. There's a mutual exchange that's occurring, and typically a lot of times we think, oh, we're memorizing the Scripture, and in a real sense, I feel like the Scripture is studying us. And if we have eyes to see and ears to hear, which Revelation calls us to multiple times, I think we'll realize that the text is a lot more intrusive than maybe what it is that we're okay with it being. But yeah, I failed miserably on how to read the book of Revelation.
Well, your failure will be our victory then. I guess.
See, I hope so.
So you're talking about really a document and a canon, right, that influences us the more time we spend with it. And the biblical narrative certainly does that. You talk a lot about transformation in this book. You mentioned we start at the same place we end at the same place we started, but not. Yeah. And in a time when so many voices say, just do you, be yourself, you're fine the way you are. Would you kind of wave the flag a little bit for transformation and why it should be something we should pursue?
Yeah, man. I mean, honestly, here's kind of my struggle. Well, I do this sometimes, and it's kind of a weird way of saying this, but I sit there at times and I think, if I were Satan, what would I attack? And what's I'm actually like a trained historian that is trained in the history of the Bible, but actually realizing the Bible is transforming me, and I can see the tactics of Satan throughout history, and they seem to cycle. But the one that he's attacking right now is absolutely this idea, and I think it's actually led to the church abbreviating is probably the right word, the gospel. I'm very convinced that one of the things that Satan is accomplishing is actually getting us to stop short of the true depth of the gospel. I do believe that the gospel, saves us. I do believe that Christ's sacrifice saves us. But it's like I tell my students a lot. It's like, but that's the entry point to the goal of the gospel. That's not where the gospel ends. And I think from Genesis 1 all the way through Revelation 22, you see God's goal is to set all the wrongs right, is to transform everything. And so if I were Satan in this world today, yeah, I would convince people with mantras like, you were just born this way, so just accept it and just move on. Or I would even get, moderate or mediate with couples. This one, like I'll have this couple and be like, I broke up with him because, he wanted me to be someone different. And my response was like, well, I sure hope he did. It's like, I hope my wife wants me to be different. Because if I'm the same person I am today as I was 16 years ago whenever we fell in love, then that's miserable for everyone. But we have this world right now that I don't think that we believe. I don't even just think that our world doesn't believe transformation is possible. I don't even think they think it's a holy endeavor. I think they think it's something that actually is seditious, that is evil, to talk about you need to become someone different. But the thing that's interesting to me is as we're chanting all these mantras or follow our own hearts, and this is just how you are, we're actually drowning. We're struggling. And so I think at one point I even say it doesn't surprise me that we're drowning in antidepressants and suicide reports. Because the very thing that our soul longs to be, and that is to be different, to transform, we're told is not possible. And so we're just, instead of this freeing, you were born this way, so just embrace it. We actually think it's a prison that we don't know what to do with. And in our dark moments, are those moments whenever we are alone and we know we don't like what we see in the mirror, we lose hope of anything being different.
Yeah. You talk about abbreviating the gospel, and one of the ways, and you mentioned this in the book, one of the ways that we do that is we don't fully understand the S word, sin, right? That we really don't put it out for all that it's worth. We don't actually, what did you say? You talk about that what happened in the garden is actually worse than we think.
Yeah.
Right? Because of sin. And then I think the really fascinating word that you spend a lot of time developing, and I think it's really well done, is this idea of what union means.
Yeah.
Can you talk about sin? Can you talk about union and how that really affects the first tree and life before the second?
Yeah, that was an interesting, I don't even know how to say this. That was an interesting insight that surprised me. Like as I was writing, really looking at whenever you start looking at the Bible through the lens of union, it starts to emerge everywhere, strikingly so. And then this is one of the things I love about the Bible too, is that it's not just looking into the text and then being caught in only what the words say. It's actually allowing those words then to be a filter to look at everything. So as I started wrestling with the concept of union, it was like, I'm sitting in a coffee shop and I'm writing and I take a drink of the latte and I'm sitting there going, okay, there is a union that just happened between me and this drink. And then I think about food and I think about all these different ways in which we see this coming together in very unique ways, where a lot of times you can't even then decipher there is two things that have come together, but they've become one. And I found it interesting that Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, so the linchpin between the two chapters on creation leading into the fall, it's the verse that leads into the serpent coming to tempt Adam and Eve. That verse specifically says, and talking about Adam and Eve, and the two became one flesh. And I sat there and thought, why is that the transition verse that makes so much sense from moving from this to this? And then the question started to become, that's actually what you see in the new heavens and the new earth. You see, the bride coming down from heaven beautifully dressed for her husband, and then heaven and earth come together. So then I started asking this question, do we really understand what happened in Eden? And was it more? So I think one of the subtitles, one of the chapters is sin. It's worse than hell.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we think all that sin is it translates us from one place to another, or even from one status to another. from innocent to now guilty, from earth to now hell. And I'm not even saying those are not true. That's where the word abbreviated becomes important to me. It's not that it's wrong. Abbreviations aren't wrong. It's just the shortened version. And so a lot of times it's like reading an abridged book. I always feel like I'm robbed. I'm like, there's so much more, and it's like
the experience.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And it's actually sitting in it and fully understanding the full scope.
Yeah, and when you read the unabridged version of a book, it actually a lot of times gives you nuances and character developments that you never saw before. And whenever I started doing that with sin, I began to realize that we may really be selling this short. That the problem may be way more pervasive and frightening. And there's really no other, it's terrifying to think that actually it's not just about going to hell, it's actually us becoming one flesh with death. That sin is not just an indiscretion, it's an act of transformation, or actually deformation. We become less than human. And that to me kind of then asks the question, moved me to, if that's the pervasiveness of the problem, maybe the solution is more beautiful than we ever thought too.
Well, and on that, spoiler alert, there's actually a third tree, kind of right smack dab in the middle of your story and in history's timeline, right? And I love how you wove in the cross into that as being the answer. But you also spent a lot of time developing this idea that that's not always so cut and dry, that bringing people into the light is a little counterintuitive to the darkness that we all crave. Talk to us a little bit about that process of why we see so many problems in our world when the solution seems fairly easy.
Yeah, and that kind of actually leads to what are the ramifications of becoming one with death?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's kind of interestingly, that's actually like the second part of the book. The movement of it is it's like, okay, if we become one flesh with death, what does that mean then? What does that change? How does that affect us? And really kind of the chapter that really tackles what you're talking about is I call it Darkness Fears the Light, which is counterintuitive as children. One of the things, I don't know if you noticed in the book, but there's a lot of the times where I think back to as children what was most clear. And as a child, we were afraid of the dark. Yeah. And that to me was something that reflecting back on my own life, I remember terrified in our basement and would even say out loud my brother's name because he would sleep on the other end, like, hey, Justin. I was like, dang it, he's asleep. I'm like, oh no, the darkness felt darker. But then I would look at like the night lights, and I had my little He-Man night light, and I would look at it, and it was almost as if it was telling me like, you're not alone. Yeah. But what's interesting is as we get older, it's almost like that flips. It's like we become so accustomed to the darkness that whenever light comes to us, it comes to us as a threat. Even this past week, I was writing a sermon on Isaiah 5 and 6. And Isaiah 5, around verse 20, it starts talking about, it starts giving woes. Woe to the one that, and it has this interesting thing where it says, woe to the one that looks at evil and calls it good. And woe to the one that looks at good and calls it evil. And then it says, woe to the one that looks at the light and calls it darkness.
Interesting, yeah.
And it's this fascinating switch that whenever we become one flesh with death, it's not just affecting a status, it's actually affecting the way that we are able to perceive everything, even light itself. So if we are so accustomed to the darkness, but light starts to come towards us with a hug, we could actually see the outstretched arms as an advance of striking us. And typically this is the way we translate things. So we look at the exile of Israel as a punishment, when in reality I'm going, it was hydrogen peroxide being poured on a wound. And every child thinks that you're hurting them, sure. But actually you're healing them. Right. And so is there something lost in translation? And so I do believe that once we became one flesh with death, we became disciplined in the native tongue of death and the native way of thinking and speaking and processing all of reality is shrouded in a darkness to the point where if love became flesh, we would kill it.
Right.
Which to me was a startling...
Sure. Yeah, I know. And what you do with union is so well, and won't give too much away, but just your whole take on union. You're tying the fruit in the garden to communion in the New Testament. Honestly, first time a huge light bulb went on in my head. Like, wow, I'd never thought about how symbolic and rich and maybe even literal. You know, all that is. So, you know, one of the interesting things you went after. I love how timely this thing is. You know, you're talking about a narrative that swings the eternity, but at the same time, you're talking about stuff that's very pressing with where we live today. You talked about racism in here and how it plays into life in between two trees. Why'd you go there?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Because, you know, the grammar of death, first of all, let me say this. First of all, it's because of how much it hits home to my family.
Okay.
We're a blended family. We adopted my youngest son, so I have a black son who is adopted, but then I have 3 biological children that are white. And you just view things different whenever you realize a lot of the comments of racism aren't talking about something abstract, but they're talking about my boy. It's even been fascinating. I don't even think I talk about this part in the book, but whenever we even were telling our family that we were adopting a particular individual in the family, first thing they said was, "Oh, tell me it's not a black child." And I had to look at him and say, "It is." Yeah. And you're just going to have to get used to that.
Because of their own prejudice.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, because of their own fear.
Yeah.
And this is where a lot of this is whenever we're one with death, we're governed by a fear of the unknown, which also encapsulates light. Light is unknown whenever you're accustomed to darkness. And there's an unknownness of something that is lack of familiarity. But one of the things I love about Revelation is that Revelation is also saturated with this phrase over and over and over. It's repeated, every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And so there's a concept in the book of Revelation, and you know, I mean, obviously it echoes what's been being said in the Old and the New Testament as a whole. That actually our God is the one that created all of the beauty and the diversity and all the different colors of the trees and of our own skin. It's the reason why I don't like the concept of color blind.
Sure.
Is because I'm going like, no, we don't have to be colorblind. Let's actually celebrate the colors.
Your son is black for a reason. God
Yes.
made him black for a reason. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
you know, and my son has even wrestled with that. He's actually even looked at us and said, I want vanilla skin like you. And I, you know, getting down to him and saying, but Robert, if you had skin like mine, you wouldn't be Robert, and I want you. So the first reason why I went there is because it hits me close to home. But I also think it's an exaggerated something that you can see all throughout history. Racism is not new. This is something it's like lust. It's like one of those tricks that Satan uses over and over and over, and every generation falls for it. And there's a part of it where I look at the church and just say, come on, eventually we got to figure out ways to break these cycles. Like, we can do this. Like, whenever we actually have the light that's dispelling the darkness, there has to be a means by which we break some of these cycles that generations have fallen for years and years and years. But if I'm Satan, why invent a new trick? I mean, if they keep falling for it, why not just keep using it? But I do think it just so happens to be something that, as you said, is timely in the fact that, I mean, our country's had struggles with racism for years, but it does seem to be exploring new avenues in our society today that I want to just allow it to be something that, that the gospel is able to speak into. This world caught between two trees, it's a mess and it's chaotic, but there is something about that tree between two trees, the cross of Calvary, that doesn't just break down barriers, but actually gives them opportunities for healing. And so in there, I even talk about how a particular family member of mine is actually, you watch the gamut moving from racism to healing through the story of my son. And it's, for me, it's been a powerful witness for me, not because I came to them and the person was perfect already, but watching them wrestle with the pain of racism from their past as they embrace a new grandchild in that case has been very humbling. Because typically a lot of us, you don't ever get to see the cycle of transformation in someone's heart and life. But my grandma gave me that gift.
And you really have to put yourself in proximity to meet people that are different than you and take steps towards union, right? And that seems to be a really common theme with racism is separation,
yes,
right? And that's really what we're all marching towards, is every tongue, tribe, nation, a place of union, and we're all are together as one. It's still different,
Yes,
and
yes.
diverse and beautiful, but one under
Absolutely.
the second tree.
And that's actually the two chapters that kind of are next to each other. One's called Divided We Fall, but then the next chapter is called Separate We Stand. And so the division of racism, how it divides us, is frightening to me. But there is a holiness and separateness, and that's where I'm going, no, it's not being colorblind.
Sure.
It's actually appreciating what makes us different, and realizing that it's in that difference where we actually can find the whole expression of God's love and God's will for us.
So you talk about your son, you talk about that process of very personally, right? This is not a commentary where you just talk about, here are some things that you might read in Revelation or the Bible. Right? You really do bleed on the page a little bit.
Yeah.
And talk to me about the process of like why you decided to do that. Why do you put that out there? Because you put some real personal things on here, and then you go, here, world, read, and that's a risky thing as a communicator, as a storyteller, to be really honest. But what I love about this, and knowing you like I do, the Bible has been reading you for a long time and has been doing a work on you, and the gospel has as well. But why put it, Nick, here in this book?
No, that's this concept of how far you go in self-disclosure is something that a lot of us religious leaders, we talk about a lot, because we don't know how far to go. We don't know how much to disclose. We don't know how much to keep, because there's a wisdom where if you throw everything out there, it can be frightening. I'm just kind of bored with that. There's a part of me where I'm like, I love living in a space where I don't have anything to hide. And so there's a part of me where I look to Joseph, and I'm going, thank God he didn't hide the struggle that he had with wanting to crush his brothers when they were in front of him, but instead it actually had a moment where he had to dismiss them, and he's breaking down and weeping. And thank God that David didn't keep his story hidden with Bathsheba, because he could have edited the annals of Scripture, because he was the king. Thank God that Jesus didn't hide his genealogy that contains all these brokenness and these, and thank God that Paul didn't tell us about his anti-Christian killing as Saul. And there's a part of this where I think we've lost some of this in the church. We've lost some of the authenticity, the rawness of the fact that we all, number one, we've all been broken and have broken people in unique ways. But number two, transformation only comes when you see the contrast. And so there's a part of this where whenever I sit down to write again, I was writing on how to read Revelation, and it started to read me. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to be fair to the work of the Scripture that I was longing in other people if I wasn't allowing them to see my diary, to see my journal, to see the greatest wounds. And I'm not exaggerating there. They are the greatest wounds that I have ever experienced, but being pulled out. And honestly, I've done this, I've told my story a couple of times in preaching settings. And what I have found is that that it actually invites people to come out of the woodwork and to share their own story. And literally, to me, it's a practice of refusing to allow any parts of my heart to be too accustomed to darkness, but to push them out into the light, because whenever they're out into the light, the very act of pronouncing them breaks a unique hold. So why is it a risk? Oh yeah. I mean, I'm not even gonna lie. Like, there's a part of it where there's a vulnerability I'm not even totally comfortable with. But I honestly, I wish more leaders would be more honest about this, about the ways they've been broken in the past, and maybe it would prevent some of the ways in which the leaders have broken people in their presence.
Yes.
Because I'm just like, hey, let's just pull the skeletons out of the closet so that we can all figure out ways to show each other grace, as opposed to keeping them hidden and trying to figure out ways to demonstrate a false perfection that isn't real.
Well, and by doing that, you really are saying, hey, your past can't disqualify you. Something that was done to you or something you've done, it cannot disqualify you from the second tree.
Yeah.
Right.
And that to me is the fruit of the tree between two trees, of the cross of Calvary.
Yes.
That is the fruit of it, is that it's because of this tree, the between two trees, is why the polar edges don't have to be completely frustrating, is because we will get to eat from that fruit because we are actually imbued with this fruit. And that's where the Lord's Supper, when we ingest the fruit of the tree between two trees, it actually unites with us in such a way that, I mean, listen, I just told my wife, I just said, I at this point in my life, I can't even, like, there's even danger in me saying this in a forum like this. It's like, but I can't even imagine living in a world where I have secrets I have to manage. I love the fact that my wife knows everything about me. I love the fact that my wife will pick up my phone and she knows my password and pulls up, and she's just looking for a text that her and I had gone back and forth, but I don't have to worry about any of that. Because there's a part of it where it's like, no, she knows my past, she knows my present, and by God's grace, I hope she also will be able to know my future. But, you know, there is a measurement of wisdom in that, but I'll worry about where to restrain at some other point.
Clean living's good living. You know, I mean, really is.
Clean living's good living.
And like, look, it's out there now.
Yes.
So nothing you can do about it. It's
No.
going to go on trucks and go to bookstores. Do bookstores still exist? If they do, they'll go there, and then it's out there. But I think you hit the nail on the head. That the middle tree truly is the bridge between the first and second, right?
Yeah.
That through Christ's death, if we share in his death, we also share in the life. Can you, as we get to kind of wrap this up, what does that third tree mean for us now marching towards the third?
Yeah, man, I tell you what, the tree between two trees, the cross of Calvary, to me, what does it mean? Well, and this is kind of the way in which I end the book, by going through navigating the real life implications of the tree between two trees. The way in which we deal with pain and the way in which we deal with just the everyday struggles of life. But I end with a chapter that talks about our God is a God of pursuit. And the tree between two trees for me is this climactic moment where God is demonstrating that there is no way in which he will not pursue us. But for me, the cross is merely this climactic something that he actually begins at Christmas. Where for me, the concept even of atonement is not something that begins and ends at the cross. It's something that begins whenever the Word becomes flesh. And the moment that he becomes flesh, he gains access to the brokenness of our story. And then it climaxes in him allowing us to choose how he dies. There's this like hiccup in Philippians 2 that I'm always enamored by. You know, that's the passage. You know, you should have the same attitude as Christ Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, which I even point out, like grasped like a fruit. But you know, he empties himself, and then eventually it says, and he becomes obedient to death, and then it says, even death on a cross. Sure. I'm like, where's the hiccup? Why the hiccup? Why say it twice? I think it's because whenever Christ became flesh, he was intent on pressing all the way through the union that we had already chosen, and that's death. But he actually allows us to choose how he will die. And there's a grace in this. There's a pursuit in this. There's a ridiculousness, an absurdity to this that for me says more not just about where it is that I'm going, but about who it is that actually I'm becoming one with. The indwelling of the Spirit is 1/3 of the Trinity living in us. And that indwelling pushes us towards a God that won't just become flesh to rescue us, but will actually allow us to choose the way we execute him.
Did you just say 1/3 of the Trinity living? Are you kidding me?
Isn't that absurd?
Is this in here? Where is that? It's
man.
really kind of mind-blowing.
I know. Yeah, the passage from Paul, the same Spirit that resurrects Jesus from the dead resurrects us. Yeah, there's a union here in our stories that's pretty startling. As a matter of fact, that's where Paul says in Ephesians 5, he quotes Genesis 2:24. He says, for two become one flesh. And he goes, and I'm talking about a profound mystery, because I'm not just talking about husband and wife, I'm talking about Christ and the church.
Okay, so Between Two Trees, when can we get it? When's it releasing? Where can we find it?
Yeah, it drops February 12th, so it'll be it'll be available everywhere, from Amazon to, I mean, if there are bookstores like you mentioned, it'll be there.
Okay.
You know, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, you know, which is everywhere.
Paperback, Kindle.
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
and also to even an audiobook. So an audiobook, and I'll be actually reading the book. And it also, sorry, I forgot, there's like 1,000 things coming with it. There'll even be an 8-week video series that churches or small groups can go through that's free through Ozark Christian College, but it'll be called Between Two Trees. So
you could just watch that maybe at Sunday school or in a small group.
yeah, they're about, I think, 12 to 18 minutes long, and they kind of break the book into 8 sections. Yeah.
But who is this for? You know what I'm saying? This isn't just for Bible experts or
No.
end times fanatics.
No.
This is really for who?
I mean, truthfully, let me just be honest. It's first for me.
Okay.
Like this is, I almost feel like this is my therapy on page.
Okay.
Like truthfully.
It's cheaper.
Yeah. I don't know, man.
By the hour.
Yeah, you're right.
By the hour. It's
You buy the right.
Yeah.
No, it's actually for the Christian that wants the gospel story to become something that invades their life.
Okay.
It's written in a very meditative, contemplative, diary-like fashion. Do we dive deep into theology? Yeah, but not inaccessibly deep. Not in ways that that's only for the scholars that can parse Greek, you know, optatives or something. Like it's not. It's written for the Christian that cares.
Yeah.
The Christian that wants this to be more than just something they do on Sundays.
Yeah, and I found it to be very hopeful as well.
Good.
Well, I appreciate you sharing it
Hey.
with me. I'm so glad you didn't write the book you set us to write. Like, your failure really will bless us all. Maybe next time, next time you carve out 3 weeks in Rhode Island, you can actually get something done.
I'll see what I can do.
You tried to do. But I really do think Between Two Trees is going to bless a whole lot of people.
I appreciate that tons, man. Thank you.